Okay, so that's the title I've been thinking about for like since last night. But alrighty, so I've definitely given this some thought. I'll wait till we're further into this. But for those just joining us, I am in the process of re-examining a list of ideas we did before. So my general premise has always been that if you give multiple artists the same building blocks for a work, you'll get multiple stories and interpretations. So to sort of make my point there, I would say pick a list of stories from TV and movies of the last 30, 40 years, 80s, 90s, early 2000s mainly, and take a look at them, break them down for what makes them them, and then imagine how we could make a different work with those ideas. And so I did a bunch of them: League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, Terminator, Blade Runner, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I took a bunch of those things, rewrote them as different ideas. So Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, one of the very first ones we did was League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. And I did, what if it was pulp heroes like Doc Savage? Or I think my favorite out of that one was, what if we did the Count de Saint Germain finds the guy who discovered Dr. Moreau's Island, goes to Dr. Moreau's Island and finds the second and third generation altered creatures that look predominantly human, but can do things that only their animal ancestors could do. So with that premise, he brings them to our world, figuring that was part of the thing. You know, he's going to supervise and watch over them and take care of them. But when they're in their own world with only one human as their example, they don't get a sense of belonging to a society or a culture. Bring them over to our world, and the pressure to conform to our society and our world will be more substantial. That's the idea I was going for. So you basically get these animals that are human looking, and it sort of becomes like an X-Men series. So that was one of the ideas I got from the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. I did pulp heroes as well. So like the long forgotten characters like the Phantom and whatnot, the Shadow, those types of characters that predate most superheroes, but are like the precursors to most superheroes. And I said, like, what if we did a series about them? That's very close to the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. But the next one we worked on was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And so what I did was, instead of 4 male turtles, I changed it to 3 female corvids, so crows or ravens. Instead of ninjas, I did a more of a detective private investigator setup, and I kind of like both of those. It's weird that they both had the anthropomorphic theme, but at any rate, we took this concept of doing this, and we took, like I said, Terminator, Blade Runner, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and a few others, came up with new ideas, new stories, new settings, new characters, inspired by what was done with the original. So with that in mind, we built this nice little bundle of these things. I wrote down all the data on a text file on my computer, and we proceeded to go forward with the adventure of making some of those. And I made a nice big list of other things we could explore. Since then, I have had a computer crash. My hard drive destroyed itself. And among all of the many, many, many things that got destroyed in that process, one of them was the grand file of all the things that I was building. But we do have a record of me making the videos about these ideas that I could review. But what better opportunity than this one that we have right now for me to redo them and come up with stories based off of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, Jurassic Park, Blade Runner, Terminator, Roger Rabbit. If we take a look at all of those and come up with stories inspired by them without the ability to look back to see what we did before, because it was a couple months ago, several months ago at least, and I don't recall all of them. I remember little bits occasionally of some of them, but I don't recall everything that we did. So, hitting those ideas again and just starting from scratch on those ideas, it's very interesting to see what we get different. Now, it's not a pure experiment as if you had two people who had no information about what the other has ever done, because I do know that what we did last time for Jurassic Park, last time we did Jurassic Park, I believe we did a cyberpunk setting in which you went into a virtual park, and it was a fantasy park with orcs and ogres and wizards and necromancers and whatnot. And it just so happens that those characters are created by an AI, or are AI characters. And part of the magic of the world is the manipulation of the world, which, if it's a virtual reality park, would have been essentially hacking the universe. So if you have a wizard, an evil necromancer or sorceress, who can hack the universe using their magic, then if you have somebody go into their world, the AI sorceress hacks the world that they're in, and therefore hacks it so that they can switch bodies. When that body wakes up from cyber sleep or virtual reality, it's not the person who went in who comes out. And that was my Jurassic Park, where you have a person trapped within the virtual reality trying to A, get out, and B, stop the ones that got out in their body from freeing more of them and taking over the world. That was my Jurassic Park done sci-fi, virtual reality, artificial intelligence wise. This time, we're doing Arthro-Park, I guess is what I'm calling it. It just seemed like a fun idea to call it that. So Arthro-Park is essentially a massive Universal Theaters or Disney theme park, large plot of land, all converted to house massive terrariums full of insectile ecosystems. So basically insect farms or arthropod farms. And so if you have this massive park that's just, it's 100 acres, 200, 500. I don't know how big Disney is. We could probably look that up right now. How big is Disney Park? So 85 acres. Disneyland. Is that Disneyland or Disney World? Oh, okay. Magic Kingdom Park is 107 acres. Disney California Adventure is 72 acres. And Knott's Berry Farm is 57 acres. So it's a substantial chunk of real estate. Good evening to you as well. So you're talking about a couple hundred acres. Now, if you made a couple hundred acres of enclosed insect terrariums within a park-like atmosphere, especially if you're going to design the park such that the people and parts of things that we move through those parks will be small enough, like a 6 foot tall human might be a 6 millimeter tall human. If that's the case, 6 millimeters is probably like that. Roughly that size. So if that's the case, if that's the size of a human, and our ability to move trucks or golf carts or however you transport around the setting, then you don't need roadways and fairgrounds and commons like in Disney that are full size. Something this wide is a sidewalk to somebody who's 6 millimeters tall. Something this wide is going to be more than enough to be a roadway to run golf carts down or to build a mini light rail. Your infrastructure costs are way down. You want to do the monorail from Disney Orlando? Cool. I've got a model train set we can set up and it'll do just fine. So your infrastructure costs are just next to nothing. You built a model park and it's the perfect, it's perfect for what you need it to be. And you do that model park up through the middle. And it's just like, so this idea of how easy it would be to set this park up for us to travel through, that's fine. The setting up the terrariums for all the insects, that's going to be the labor intensive and cost difficult portion of this exercise. If you make it multi-stories, if you make it like a 3 to 5 story tall mall where it's all these little terrariums, you could fit a massive universe full of fascinating things in that size of a space. But the question of why would somebody do this? And how did they decide that this was the right thing to do? And I've been banging my head against it since last night. And I had this idea earlier today to do it differently. So I had this really, this moment, this epiphany. The idea of so many things can happen because we've been doing something backwards the whole time. So my mind started playing around with, what if we had this technology developed and it was seemingly just a gimmick for so long because we'd been using it wrong? Well, not wrong. It has uses going from small to large that are sort of novelty uses until somebody has the brainstorm of going the other way. So this is where I started. There's a little bit of a difference as we go a little bit further. But if you start with the idea of we have the ability to have a small wormhole that we start open on the other end much bigger. I'm going to put a wild strawberry through it. Now I'm going to have what was probably a 1 millimeter sized wild strawberry, 1 to 2 millimeters, is now going to be a 1 to 2 foot sized strawberry. And the reason it's majority novelty at that point is, if we're going with the sense that if you go through the big end and come out the small end, being able to leap like what is it? You'd be 6 millimeters tall and able to leap the same distance you could leap as a full-sized adult human. So if I could jump a yard at my current size, then at the micro size, I could jump a yard from 6 millimeters. So that would look like the Hulk jumping across the city at that scale. That's half the fun of that idea. But if we take that same premise and go the other direction, if we go the other direction and go from small to large, you have the caveat that the strain of being such a small thing spread out so much doesn't make it as viable as a life form. But if it's just something I'm going to eat, then it'll fill my stomach. But calorically and nutritionally, it's going to be the same as one wild strawberry. So it's like diet food. That's the gimmick that picks this up. A chocolate chip becomes a giant hunk of chocolate. It tastes like chocolate. It fills your stomach like a whole giant chunk of chocolate, but it's at the calories of a chocolate chip. That, to me, is a fun gimmick. And it's a fun way to start it out with this stupid, sort of marginally useless thing. So I'm not familiar with Joe's, but the premise of that being one of the things that gets done with it, I think, is fun. The awareness that anything coming through, like an amoeba, JPEGs, yes. There is a granularity loss, yes. But there's the possibility of also looking at it from the perspective of, like, I'm sure it occurred to somebody before that they could go in the other direction too. And that would be something like chemical waste, where it's not viable for the environment. It's not good for the environment. Certain companies can't help but produce some of it. And it's not going to be a loss of valuable materials. Because like sewage contains a lot of like phosphorus and other important chemicals for our environment. If you just compost it properly and biodigest it properly with a biogas generator, if you do that, you can reclaim a lot of the usefulness from something like sewage, and compostable materials and things like that are valuable that way. But chemical wastes, I can fairly easily see if they're too difficult to reclaim any valuable resource. So like iron rust in the environment could be a toxic thing in the water supply, but you don't want to decrease the available useful iron compounds within the world by disappearing a lot of rust. You can resmelt that into a real chunk of iron again. But there are certain things that are not valuable and would be beneficial to decrease the size and minimize the cost and difficulty of containing them. So I imagine there would be some of that. But I think the thing I want to set up and as a sort of a caveat to that is, you can only create wormholes that go one direction. So the idea is you can create a wormhole that goes from big to little, or a wormhole that goes from little to big, but you can't go backwards through the little to big. You can't go from an ant goes through and becomes a giant ant that collapses under its own weight and then push it back through the big end to the little end. No, it's a one-way trip. Anything going backwards through a wormhole just gets disintegrated into energy. And that energy could be yet potentially another use for it, where those things like nuclear waste that you don't necessarily want to make smaller and risk potentially fissioning it, like we were joking about yesterday. If you run it backwards through a big to little or a little to big portal, it will turn into energy. If you can find a way to tap that energy, and maybe they haven't figured that one out yet, maybe that's how they fuel the energy to keep the wormholes running. But at any rate, that's sort of like a limit I'm trying to put on it, because not only does that limit of only being able to go one way through a wormhole mean that you have to invest in both kinds, but it's also a limit on our mental capacity. Like, we look at a wormhole that makes big things little, but it can't make little things big, then that's only useful for making big things little, and we don't think about the other one. And even when we create the other type of wormhole, we think of them as two separate entities. It's sort of like a what's a good example of something like that, where we have two things that kind of reverse each other and compare themselves to each other. But if you put them together, they have a function you wouldn't otherwise have thought about. And it took somebody who said, I have a thought. What if we put them together for a purpose? At that case, you have this discovery happen of somebody who goes, I can take the big things and make them little and have valuable and useful things happen at that scale. But now it's important that it's reversible. So not only can we make big things little, but we can make little things big. So once we make a big thing little, we can make it big again. That ability to do that makes huge differences in the applications we can put this technology to. And that prospect of somebody figuring out that potential application means it's a ripe environment for playing around with. So this park may start out as the idea of figuring out that if we do this right, we can use spider silk and silkworms to generate strands of silk that are super molecular, fine, thin strands. But when we get down to that size, they're going to be as thick as a standard rope. But they're going to be a single filament, not a woven thing. And we take that material through the wormhole. And yes, you're going to have the change of something that's as thick as a strand of rope having the tensile strength of a single strand of spider web. So mechanically, it's not the most valuable thing in the world. But as a single sort of molecular chain, it has potential for other applications. Now, whatever applications they put it to. So just basically like things you can do. on that scale. There are some plant-based things you can do on that scale. And this requires a little rethinking certain things. Like if we're gonna stick with the premise that anything that goes through the little to big has the same properties. So if you go from little to big, it maintains, all right, welcome back. If you go from little to big and you maintain the same properties of the thing on the little scale, then it limits some of the applications you can put that to. But it also offers some strange opportunities. So like the most venomous insect bites in the world, if you take that venom at the micro scale and bring it up to the macro scale, because I believe there's a type of venom from a sea snail that even the smallest portion of it is so deadly that they can't dilute it enough not to kill whatever they put it in. Now, if you take this dose, the smallest dose you can get that's still lethal, because you can't get any smaller and you can't get any less lethal, and you take it through the little hole into the big side, when it comes out, the proportion of the amount you have, you can cut into smaller portions again and get an even smaller dose. You could conceivably get a medicinal dose of that toxin. And so being able to do that same thing on a scorpion or a tarantula or any of those types of things, and farm some of those things. The silks, they're going to have about the rough equivalent strength of, I think at that point, you're talking about a thickness of rope, maybe like that, that's going to have the strength of maybe toilet paper wound into a strand like that. But it's not entirely useless. And it's completely biodegradable. It's made out of protein. So I could see it potentially being used. I mean, it would probably be tissue paper, maybe a little bit stronger than that. You'd have to, that's one of the things I'd have to do for this. You'd have to crunch the math on a lot of things like that. I'm thinking, like, I'm pretty sure you could suspend a couple grams from a single strand of the strongest spider web. And so if it were the strength of, it would almost be like a giant spaghetti noodle. Yeah, and so it's very interesting to see what the potential applications of something like that might be. Now, we don't have to go into huge detail about all those specific things. We have the application of the adhesives that spiders use on some of their webs. You have the venoms. You have some of the secretions of ants and bees. You have the possibility of food produced that has, the honey from a colony of bees. You could take a thimble full of honey, walk it through one of these wormholes, and come out with a bucket full of honey that has the same calories as a thimble full of honey. And so it's just sort of like, it has potential. And that potential for materials goes both ways. So you have the possibility of somebody in our world using current technology to build a microcomputer processor, usually put on a chip this big to put inside a computer. You take a processor of that size and you just build a multi-core processor until it's 3 feet in diameter. You run it through one of these wormholes, and now you have a 3-foot diameter processor's capabilities that fit in a 3mm sized processor. So now you have the ability to develop technologies that exceed where we're currently capable of doing. And that was another application. And so you have some of these minor applications happening for the use of this technology, and then some crazy genius happens on the idea of, not only can we farm from insects various materials that are valuable and useful by building this giant farm, this terrarium farm full of all the different arthropods, you test it. How do you predict what voltage it's going to use? You test it. You build a couple of models of a 3-foot wide diameter material. You do testing and predictive calculations for what you're going to do next. Now, I do think it's kind of important to also make the caveat that anything that goes through the big to little, if you take it out around that gate and try to put it through the big to little again, you can't shrink a thing twice, and you can't grow a thing twice. Growing a thing twice may very well just shatter the atomic structures. You're going to get nuclear degradation, atomic degradation at that point, I would imagine. And that's not a thing you want to play with. Taking something and making it smaller and smaller, that second round would essentially just shred it into its constituent energy. Well, I don't know. I don't know whether it should fuse or whether, because I mean, it would be the equivalent of doing an implosion. The atoms getting too big to contain themselves together are going to degrade. They're going to shed their electrons and become the nuclei loose, which is just radiation. They're just going to radiate, collapse, crumble, and just excrete radiation everywhere. If you do the reverse, where you squeeze everything in too tight, would it implode, or would it just shred itself into pure energy? I don't know. And I feel like it should do it while passing through the wormhole. And maybe that's an important part of the story. What we should have is somebody using 2 of these gates, or 4 of these gates, maybe 6 of them, however you want to do them, but they're paired gates, a big to little and a little to big, paired with more of those. And the thing is, maybe the reason we have the panic or the problem that occurs is somebody tried to do an end round and take advantage of a second round through one of these pieces of technology, one of these wormhole gates, and it overloads the gate collapses and sets off enough energy radiation that it disrupts or interferes with other aspects of the environment. It overloads the system. And that's, so if it happens within the gate, you don't have, it's happening inside a tunnel. And if it overloads and blows out, it's gonna blow out either side of that gate a little bit. But the excess of energy released in that situation will cause that gate to collapse or disintegrate itself. But that energy is going to send out enough of a disruption that security measures put around the rest of the park will go down. So it's sort of like what Newman did at Jurassic Park, where I call him Newman. I forget what the character's actual name was. They interfered with the security systems on the computer to allow them to escape with something they stole. Somebody who's trying to make an additional breakthrough by taking one of these processors, running it through the big to little gate, and then handing it off to somebody on the outside to see if they could pass through again with that same thing. The person going through the second time will destroy the gate, and in the process destroy all the security measures around the park that make it possible to safely navigate through that park. That sounds like a good idea to me. That sounds like the way to make that story work. In the meantime, there was also another thing that occurred to me, that if you lived in a world where somebody, some goofy billionaire, taking two pieces of tech that are essentially considered gimmicky, where you can shrink your waste products and grow your food products to not have any more calories, but they strung them together, and suddenly you have a whole potential for innovations that are amazing by taking people to the small scale and giving them whole places. I mean, you could make a housing complex in an area that doesn't have enough room to house a population. You could house them in a bedroom. Like, if every person is a millimeter tall, in this room right here, which I think is probably 12 by 10, a 12 by 10 room set up with dollhouse shelving apartment units all throughout, and that I don't have to be able to walk through at full size. We don't need any space big enough for me to do it in. You could put a reasonably huge size of Brooklyn, New York into this room. This is easily a 12 block radius. Right. So you have the whole ability to build whole communities. You could put a town in a room. So housing and real estate costs become so much easier. But that's only possible when you figure out that you can have a big to little and reverse it with little to big. Up until that point, everybody's been seeing them as two separate technologies, and they're both one-way trips. But now you've figured out, ooh, here's a possibility. How many people are going to go for the option of building an apartment complex of hundreds of buildings in a bedroom that they rent for $1,000 a month? Like, you might be able to get a few people who think that's a risk they're willing to take. But I guarantee you the U.S. military and the U.S. prison industrial complex would see that as a very good way to assure that prisoners of war and prisoners of civilian level are contained and controlled. And I was like, that's a thing that I'm not sure about. I'm not sure how I feel about that. Maybe that's something to discuss in the second or the sequels. Well, because it's not something you have to maintain while you're inside, because there are doorways you pass through that do that to you, like, you can turn off the gates and there will be little Ant-Men. They will stay little and they can't revert, but they will still be able to leap large distances, and they still have the impact of somebody full size. So that's one of the things that makes this a little bit different than a Jurassic Park, is you're essentially giving superpowers to anybody who goes through one of these gates from big to little. You're You're making them tiny, but they still maintain the same strength. So right now, if there were an ant crawling on my hand and I went like that, I would be able to crush that ant. Easy. If I shrink, I'm able to get to that size. I'd be right next to that ant, but I could still hit that ant with the same amount of force, but over a smaller surface area. I'll be able to punch through its head pretty solidly. And so you have these little possibilities of basically making a Spider-Man or an Ant-Man, but you're putting them in a world full of giant insects, with the caveat that if they go out around the portal and don't exit the regular portal, they are in our world, our size. Now, if you were to go through the portal, get small, and then come into a room where I am full size, I could stomp on you, but it would have the same impact of me stomping on you full size. You're going to be much denser. So you're going to be hard. You're going to be like steel. You can't can they retain their powers? If you grow them back to full size, they don't have any powers anymore. Basically, no matter what size you are, you have the strength and sturdiness of a 6 foot tall person. So if you start at 6 feet tall and you shrink to 6 millimeters, you're going to be as sturdy and as strong as a 6 foot tall person in a 6 millimeter tall figure. But once you pass through the portal going back to full size, you're going to still retain the power of a 6 foot tall person. Either way, that's your power level. It's only superpowers when you're 6 millimeters tall. And so I think that's sort of the gimmick I'm working from. And so at that level, it's like fleas, human fleas. They can jump long distances. You can try to crush them, but they're a pain in the ass to crush. I've had it. I've lived in an apartment where somebody had cats with fleas. The little buggers are hopping 3 feet easy most of the time. They're just pew, pew, pew all over the place. You catch one of them, you pinch them between two of your fingers as hard as you can. You open your fingers and pew, it's gone. Son of a biscuit. They drive you nuts. Now, 6 millimeters is a little bit bigger than a flea, but it's going to be a similar idea. You're going to be able to jump huge distances, and you're going to be so sturdy that you can fall from a 6 foot tall surface, and it'll be like falling over as a 6 foot tall individual. 6 feet will feel like, so if you take 6 millimeters equals 6 feet, actual 6 feet at that point would be how many millimeters per foot? A lot of conversion to do. The math is there. And so it's like the biggest thing you'll have to pay attention to. And I do feel like if you do this right, you're going to want to, if you want to build a prison, which is like the sequel story, if you're going to build a prison for miniature human beings, you're going to want to put through like strong materials. So like you'll take cement blocks through and make them miniature size, because they're going to be just as sturdy and just as hard and just as strong as full size. And at that case, like a cement block is likely to be stronger than diamond when shrunken down to that size. Same with steel and things like that. You're going to get materials with a strength factor that's way more than it should be able to achieve. Just like anything on the small scale that you make large again has a scaled decrease in its strength from what it is at that level. So it becomes a weaker material on our level. But that's fine. If you start off with that's interesting. I'd be very curious to see what that would end up being like. If you start off with a piece of steel, like a nut or a bolt, and you put it from the small end to become large, and you get this giant nut and bolt setup, but the material will be so soft or crumbly in some way that the properties of that material may be just as interesting as taking something huge and making it harder than diamond. There's some definite possibilities for reimagining what to do with this technology. But for the sake of this first story, starting out with being able to make a park. Oh, no, that doesn't change much of anything. I just had that moment where my brain goes like, wait a minute. Can you imagine starting out as a 6-foot-tall person, making yourself a bowl full of ice cream, setting that bowl full of ice cream down, going through a gateway, coming out the small end, 6 millimeters tall, you could go skiing on a bowl of ice cream. And it's all edible. Now, if you ate that ice cream, it's still going to have the same calories for you. No matter what size you are. So I think that also implies sort of also implies that any shrunken prisoners are going to be able to eat so many times their own volume in food. They'd have to be eating all the damn time. This is part of the reason why the science of doing something like this is problematic. Because if you have to eat, like if you think about roughly calorically speaking, a slice of white bread is 90 calories. So you and I usually would have to consume about 2,000 calories a day to maintain a healthy weight. 2,000 calories, say your bread is cinnamon raisin bread and it's 100 calories per slice. You would have to eat 20 slices of bread to meet your caloric intake in a day. Now, when a slice of bread is as big to you as a trampoline and as thick as like waist, it's like waist high, and it's what's a big equivalent of that? It's like half a court of basketball. It's half a basketball court, or maybe half a tennis court. So you have to eat something. You have to eat 20 of those in a day. You'd have to be eating all the damn time, just nonstop. I think that's why at that point it's important that, like, you would have to shrink enough food to keep the caloric density appropriate for what you need. But as a diet opportunity, that also works. It's sort of like fasting. On a given day, if you're tiny and you're only eating giant foods, their caloric density is so low for you for the volume that you have to eat. And vice versa, if you're big and you're eating little things that were grown big, the caloric density is so low. It is definitely a weight loss gimmick. Viable for another story. I guess this is turning less into the story of Jurassic Park going crazy and doing sequels about the giant Jurassic whatevers, and more about the ramifications of playing around with size-changing wormholes. I do think the prospect of this story is pretty fun. You could do like matzah and what is it? The unleavened crackers that are available. You could definitely possibly do some of that. There are ways to do a much denser caloric concentration. I'm just saying, like, you could literally make somebody's dream possible. Like, if somebody has this dream of like a bathtub full of like chocolate pudding and just eating as much as they want. Like, when you do it at that scale, chocolate pudding at our scale for a miniature person, they could swim in a swimming pool full of it, guzzling it as they swam. And when they're finished and they've had their full, they can lounge around and just dwell on how full they feel. And when they're done and they leave, they can pass through one of those portals and the food that's in their belly will still expand, so they'll still feel full. But the caloric content that they've eaten is about the size of a third of a thimble. And so they haven't calorically consumed massive amounts. You could literally make oh my God, that has to be one of the sequel ideas. You could make a real Candyland. You can walk through Candyland and eat the gummies and the sugar drops and all the stupid little pieces of candy you want. You can eat everything. It's like the Hansel and Gretel's witch is made out of gingerbread. All the housing is made out of gingerbread. Spend the night in a gingerbread hotel. Eat your bedding when you wake in the morning if you want to. Whatever you want to do. And the caloric content that you're getting from that is so small that you don't pay for that. You actually lose weight by the end of the weekend because you're not getting the caloric content. And it's if your body's chemically processing those things down, what you end up producing for waste would probably be almost little to nothing. But yeah, that's little funny, quirky like details we can hash out at a later point if we want to play with that some more. But for the meantime, that idea of turning yourself into tiny ant-men in a giant 200 to 300 acre terrarium park, multi-story terrarium park, full of insects, where the security measures are no longer in place because somebody burnt out the whole system. Oh. And if you set it up that you have to run power. Okay. So if you have to run power to the wormholes to keep them open or to run them, but somebody runs something through one of the wormholes backwards and it blows out one of the gates, it short circuits the rest of the system. You ate half your mattress. Yep, that's kind of the way that works. But if you If somebody overwhelms the system and shorts out everything by trying to run something through one of the gates either the wrong way or twice, then none of the gates that can reverse anything are running. So you can't get big again until somebody restarts one of the gates. And if you set it up so that nobody, like no communication can happen, or there's nobody on watch, or something like that happens, then you've got tiny little ant-men fleeing from insects all around them, going crazy and trying to trap them, that have to get to a location to restart the power on generators or electrical systems, replace fuses that are bigger than they are. Whole systems of that kind of stuff are made way more difficult, and they have to get that power running to one of the gates again, even if it's just one of the gates of the right direction that they can then go through again to get to their full size again. That's, I think, the story we need to tell for the first story. The second story will be abandoning the idea of giant living creatures that are a park to go to. Nope. They may still have places where there are warehouses for that, but they're redundant security systems and not a park. But at the same time, somebody else may say, well, the idea of using it for a park is still not bad, and you could do like the Candyland park that I was talking about. That's a viable option for like a sequel. And then using it as a prison is a sequel to that, potentially. And then maybe doing the apartment situation. And once you get to that point, you can start to look at the idea of people being the borrowers, the little people that we were talking about last night. I think that's a lot of possibility to go forward with this idea. And like I said, this is all starting from the premise of taking Jurassic Park, disassembling it, finding some of the things that you can use as inspiration for new things. And as far as I know, I have never heard of anybody making a story or a series of stories that sound like this. Now, is it anything like Jurassic Park? The first one kind of, but after that, it takes a hard left turn. It's gone in an entirely different direction. So it's interesting to see what's come of this one. We're almost at an hour tonight, so I'm getting ready to call it for tonight. I think, I'm pretty sure tomorrow I'm not working a night shift, so I should be able to be a little less frazzled when I come back in and kick on for tomorrow night. So I should be game for tomorrow at 11:30 again. But yeah, I love playing with some of these ideas, and these are based off of breaking down existing franchises for ideas and inspiration. One of the other things I've actually been looking at, and I'll say it real quickly here, it's been on my mind for months, almost a year, I'd say at this point, is, and I've had the idea a little bit before and let it go and had it before, is taking names of stories, like books, novellas, and short stories that you know nothing about, and trying to figure out a story that fits the title. So we've all experienced stories where the title is misleading enough that when you actually watch it, you're like, oh, that's not what I thought was going to be in that movie. I want to know what ideas we thought it was going to be, but wasn't. And I want to hear those stories. And so I've actually, some people on YouTube recently were doing a No, well, you can definitely write stuff if you do and you want to publish something on Amazon or something like that. Let us know, and I'll let anybody else who watches these videos know about your creation, so people can go watch, read it, and whatever. But if you're creating things and you want to share them with the channel, yes, I do want people to do that. I want people to take these ideas and run with them. If you think there's a different way to do Jurassic Park than what we talked about here, or you want to take one of your ideas about turning a wormhole shrinking doorway into a weapon where you can cause things to fission and cause explosions that otherwise wouldn't, make a story about that happening. But what I'm talking about right now is somebody on YouTube not that long ago did a series of videos that were talking about the inspirations for Dungeons and Dragons style storytelling. And so they talked about Jack Vance, Fritz Lieber, and two others who are well known. I can't remember their names right now. But they have a collection of works that they've created over the years before they died. You could even look at like H.P. Lovecraft. And if you look at their bibliographies and look at the titles of all their works, look at everything they've written, and if you've never read them and you go like, well, what does Through the Doorway to Midnight mean? I want to come up with ideas for what that could mean. Propose an idea for a story based off of that name and see what I can make from it. And then maybe at some point we'll read the actual story and say like, wow, these are totally different ideas. That's just something like I remember when I was younger, one of the first times I had this impulse was Warriors of the Wind, which was later renamed Nausicaa in the Valley of the Winds. And both of those names don't tell you much of anything about what the story is. But I could write a story about Nausicaa in the Valley of the Winds or the Warriors of the Winds and make my own story based off of making that title make sense. Now, I used to do this thing where I played with that even a little bit further. But one of the things I did was when you take titles of movies and books and games and things like that, and you put them into a translator and translate them over to other languages and then to another language. This is a game, I think we used to call it Babelfish. If you translated a phrase or a name or a title into another language, say from English to French, from French to Japanese, from Japanese to Russian, from Russian to English, what you get when you get all the way back is oftentimes hilarious, but sometimes it makes you go, there's something to play with here. It usually doesn't make enough sense to use as is, but you can adjust a few pieces to get a couple title ideas for things and make new stories out of. These are just some of the things I used to play with. And I'd like to kind of get into doing some of that again. Right now, I'm still going to continue reimagining the reimaginings that we did before my computer crashed. Yeah, I think that's where it came from, Babelfish. I think we used to use that back in its early days, which I would almost say was, did it exist back around in the late 90s, early 2000s? Because I think that's probably where I spent some time playing with that. But yeah, so I did a lot of goofy things like that, and I still like to do things like that from time to time. And the results you get from that, like, I'm never short on ideas. I have less time to play with the ideas than I have ideas to play with. Yeah, I do remember that part coming from Hitchhikers, yes. It's a thing you put in your ear and it translates everything around the galaxy. So I may play with some of that in the future. I just sort of like and I may just make that what I do for a lot of my live videos at night. I may do some update vlogs on occasion, but I may just reserve these for doing these fun collaborative brainstorming and goofing around sessions. Brainstorming new ideas and challenging each of us to write something from things and share them with the group, and maybe set up a forum or a place to share that. I may do pre-recorded and edited videos again, where I do reviews of stuff, so books, comics, games, and that stuff again. Because I mean, I still read books and I still read comics. I've actually been reading a fair number of them lately, and I want to get back to sharing my thoughts on them as they exist and ideas it inspires me for other stories going forward. That's sort of always what I wanted to do with this channel. The backlog of things I have here, where I review an item and then I break it down into 6 story ideas that you could create new content from. There's a whole pile of it. Yes, the videos are pretty crappy, and my editing is probably better now than it was then. Not that I do a lot of it anymore, because I do these live. But the formatting and the styling that I did before, the audio's not great. Video probably could use some help, but it's there if you want to play with it. I think I still have a lot of the things I wrote down from a lot of the ideas that were inspired from a lot of the works that I read before. So I definitely want to go back for some of them and do some writing on them. I just wish I had more time to do that. If I can convince my job to give me a few more hours off per week, and we could potentially set up like a, certain number of hours a week for me to do some writing, and then I could share them on I think I had what is it? It's not a live journal. I had one of those stupid online blogs that I could post to if I wanted to. And if I just post regularly, yeah. If I posted to it regularly, I could build an inventory of a bunch of short stories, and followers could vote on their favorites. We can compile them into a book. I can publish them through Kindle publishing for like $1 to $3 for a download or something like that. And that would be just totally something I could have fun doing. I would love to do that. There's so much I would love to do. I need to get to work on working a little bit more on some of my role-playing game designs. So much to do. So little time. Oh no, my friend used to say, so little to do, so much time. No, wait, scratch, reverse that. And he did it so reflexively that he would say it all the time. And he'd say it so fast and just uniformly that you were like, wait, did you say it right this time, or did... And so every time I hear that, that's what goes through my head. Anyway, it's an hour and 8 minutes in. I appreciate you guys hanging out tonight. Take care. Have yourself a wonderful night, and I will catch you later. Good night. Catch you later, creator. I don't know if I'm going to make that part of my closing every night, but see you around.